Welcome back. I've got another video for you, and today I'm going to be talking about the tools that you should be expecting your developer to be using when they're working on your store. Now these are the tools that are much more based around project management, so they're not the tools that the developer will use to debug code, to write code. This is much more tools that will benefit both you as a client and the developer who's working on your store, and it will help the project to run much more smoothly if you have these things in place. One absolute key tool in terms of managing your project and in terms of making sure that all the elements of your project come together and get completed and nothing gets forgotten is a ticketing system. There's a few different options out there, anything from Bitbucket's own issue management, which gives you basic ticketing, and a similar setup with GitHub, right up to tools such as Jira, which is a very fully fledged, very complete ticketing system, which probably realistically it's overkill for most projects, but if you've got a larger project with more people working on it, then you might want to consider Jira. One which I'm quite familiar with and I often recommend to my clients is Codebase. That's a good one. It's kind of a middle ground between the basic issue and ticket management you get with the free issue management in things like GitHub and Bitbucket. It's a very cost-effective solution, but it gives you good ticket management for projects that are not overly complex. So for most people that will probably be fine, but either way, whichever solution you pick, a ticketing system is really key, because it helps you to track all the tasks that are being performed by your developer. It allows you to separate and have different tickets and different threads and conversations relating just to that particular task. It allows you and the developer both to communicate. You can do things like attach screenshots and attach files and track the progress of how each task is going. It also gives you the ability to do things like actually show links to changes in the code, which might not typically be something that you as a developer, as a client would want to look at, but for the developer it's quite useful to refer back to. So there's lots of tools there to be able to help you manage your project and the progress of each task. So typically what you'll find is that you'll create a ticket on there relating to one particular task. You'll have the conversation, you'll have the discussion on what needs to be done, and then it will go through a progressive series of steps from the task has been accepted to it's in progress to it's been deployed. Whatever kind of statuses you find useful for your particular project, you can put all those statuses in there, and you can change the status of the ticket to reflect the progress so far. Also, it allows you to do things like assign tickets to different people. So for instance, you may create a ticket and then you can assign that straight to your developer, or the developer may have a question for you on a ticket, so they might put a question in the thread and then sign it back over you. So it's a really clear and really easy way to track progress on your project overall, and it's a really good way for you to see the progress and what's happened on each task, including granular detail and whatever level of detail you want to put on there. This also makes it traceable in the future, so you can refer back to those tickets and you can see exactly what the changes were, because we all know, don't we, that if you work on something and then you have to come back and revisit that later down the line, say in a year or so, you've probably forgotten most of the detail around that. And that's one of the great benefits of a ticketing system. If you have these kind of conversations and this kind of progress of what's being worked on in terms of ticket progress, if you have all that in emails, for instance, that just very easily gets lost. Also, if you have it in phone calls, like in Scrum meetings or stand-ups or whatever meetings you might have, it's great to discuss and talk through those points on those kind of meetings. But after you've discussed those in the meetings, they should be put down into a ticket so that nothing gets forgotten, because things that you just talk about vocally, unless that's written down pretty much straight after, then some detail might get forgotten, and eventually the whole task might get forgotten if it doesn't get put down as a ticket. So it's just a really good way to manage progress on all elements of your project, and down to individual tasks, and easy to see who is responsible for what task, what the progress it is, and it's a really useful and essential tool for managing your project properly. This really goes hand in hand with the ticketing system, and that is to use a repository. A repository is simply some online storage where you can store your code, the code base which is actually used to build and develop your store. It's just a place, some disk space essentially, where you can store your code which is used to actually make your website function and your store function. It's different to just a location like a Dropbox folder or something like that, because it's structured and you can see actual code changes relating to tasks that have been done through the repository sort of GUI in the interface. They all typically give you a way to browse the code that's in there and logically kind of see the changes and see different things that have been achieved and changed, and tasks that have been done by the developer. And also a really key part of a repository is that you can actually link changes into your ticketing system. So all the ticketing systems that I mentioned in my previous section, all of those have the ability for you to actually link a code change which the developer will make in the repository, and you put a particular comment into that change, and then that will link that change onto the relevant ticket. So then you actually have a link appearing on that ticket that you can click through to see what changes are on there. So it ties into the ticketing system. It's a really good way to track the changes to your project. It gives you the ability to go back and forth between code. It allows you to structure your code better and to move changes into your different environments much more easily as well. So a repository is definitely something that you should be expecting your developer to use, and if you haven't got one set up, they will very easily be able to set one up for you. It allows access to all kinds of different ways to properly manage the code and the way that your project is developed, and without this you're sort of back to the dark ages really of sort of FTPing into your server and just copying files across, and that is really not a good way of doing things. So a repository is kind of the starting point of managing your code and tracking changes and seeing the history of changes in your code, and that allows access to things like as I've mentioned, tracking changes through your ticketing system, but also then gives you access to use a proper deployment process, which is what I'm going to talk about next, to actually get your code into your live environments for review and for testing. So a repository is definitely a really key and a good option to go for. They're not expensive. Bitbucket allows you to host free private repositories, so repositories that only you will have access to and people working on your project. GitHub does the same, but that allows you to host public repositories. So that would be for open source software, for instance, where you want anyone to be able to see those changes and to be able to see the code you're working on. Codebase, which I mentioned in the ticketing section before, that's a really good option as well. That gives you a good integration between a repository and your ticketing system, and they actually walk hand in hand really. All of the options will allow you to integrate with a proper deployment process and allow you to get your code into your live environments very easily. So a repository for the developer is an actual really essential tool that they will definitely need to have. If you come across a developer who doesn't really know what a repository is, then move on to the next one, because they really should be using one, and if they don't know, they're not experienced enough to know what a repository is, they're probably not a developer you want to work with. So yeah, get a repository. Your developer can advise and even set up an account with you, and it's a really key and essential way both for the developer to effectively develop your store and for you to be able to see historic changes and track changes and know what changes were made when and by who. So it's a really key tool. So the next part is to talk about having a proper deployment process. So as I mentioned in the last section, this is a way in which to get your code that has been developed and worked on by the developer onto your live site for review and testing. So there's a few different tools out there, but basically it's a means by which the developer can make a code change, can push that into the repository where it will become managed, and then from that point you have the ability to automatically pull that code down into your live environments and onto your servers where your site is actually running. So there's a few different ones. A popular one which you may or may not have heard of is Capistrano. There's Deployer, which is essentially Capistrano but purely PHP based. There's, if you're in the cloud, then Bitnami makes some Kubernetes based images which you can use to build and deploy your site that way. Cloud based, that's probably going to be more on the larger side of the site. So if you've got a lot of traffic, a lot of footfall, and you want to have a very easily scalable setup, then Kubernetes and the Bitnami Docker images that they supply allow you to easily scale the capacity of your site and the hardware that's running your site up and down very easily. For most stores, it's probably going to be overkill, but it's definitely consideration if you want to have that sort of next level of scalability and that next level of flexibility, really, to sort of deploy and manage your site with that greater level of sort of complexity. Does come quite a few benefits, but for the most part, using a tool like Capistrano or Deployer is a good option for most sites, and you can get a really good deployment process with those going for Magento 2. So what's the point of a deployment process? Well, in the old days, if you like, it would typically be each website would be pretty straightforward and simple, wouldn't it? So you'd have a bunch of files. Basically, you'd change a file that would relate to one page, and you would just change that file. You'd put that new file up to your web server, and then the new file will be served to people visiting and browsing that site. These days, the builds of sites are far more complex than that, so it's not the case that one file or one class or one template or anything like that will relate just to one particular page. So you've got many layers of abstraction between the actual build of the site and the way the HTML code and the content that you see on the front end is actually generated. So it's a very complex setup in comparison to how it's been historically, and to manage that and to rule out many elements of human error. Basically, you want to be able to deploy your project in a way that is automated, in a way which doesn't require you to actually go onto the server and just upload a bunch of files, which is not a good way at all of doing things these days. So deployment process will hook into your repository. It will pull down the latest code from there, which would have been developed by your developer and pushed up, The deployment process will then pull that code down and apply it to your new site version. It can also perform other operations which you're probably going to need. So Magento on a live production site will need additional steps to run on a deployment. So normally in a development environment, these steps won't be required, but there are certain files that need generating ahead of time, and certain assets. So for instance, the styling of the look of your site and your store, that needs generating ahead of time, and many PHP files need generating ahead of time for your store to properly function. And that actually running in this mode that's designed for production actually gives you a much greater boost in performance. So that's why Magento have made this distinction between a developer sort of mode that Magento can run in and a production mode. So there are a few steps that need performing in addition just to actually getting your code there. So that's part of what the deployment script will do. So that's kind of the point of it. A deployment tool and a deployment script, however you choose to do it, will allow you the functionality to actually roll back changes as well if you need to. So if you deploy something that doesn't work correctly, then you can roll back to your previous release if you want to. So it's a really good tool to give you a bit of security in terms of automating deployments. The process is tried and tested. It works every time. You don't have to worry about whether this is actually going to function correctly. Has the developer uploaded the files correctly? Have they missed anything? Or you don't have to worry about any of that because it's all automated, and it's all again based off the fact that you've got a repository and you've got all the code there, and the code has been tried and tested. So once it goes live to your production environment, you can be confident that that has been tested, and all you really need to do at that point is to have a quick once over and just a quick check, because hopefully you will have checked that already in one of your other environments, and I'll talk about that next. Something else which your developer should definitely be expecting you to have in place or expecting to work with is multiple live environments for your site. So typically you'll find that you want definitely more than one environment for your code to be present on in order to be able to test and validate that changes are correct and they are how you want them to be before changes actually go to your live production environment. So these additional environments are called staging environments, and they can be split into different types. You can have just one if that's most relevant for you, but typically with Magento, unless the site and the store is pretty much vanilla, it's pretty much straight out the box, there's not much customization to the store having been done, then I generally recommend there are two staging environments. The first one being a development environment and the second one being a UAT environment. So the first environment, the development environment, this will run in a similar configuration and a similar setup to the developer's own local environment. So in total there'll be 4 environments involved. There'll be the developer's own local development environment, which will only be accessible on his local or her local machine. Then there will be the staging environments, one or more, and then there will be the production environment finally, which is the one that customers actually use and purchase product from. So the development environment will match pretty closely with what the developer is working with on their local machine and their local setup. and this means that that environment is not actually running in this mode where you need to compile these assets and these PHP files ahead of time. That actually happens on the fly, and that has a impact on performance, having to do these on the fly. So it's a good environment just to have an initial test. So typically what will happen is the developer will create something, will perform some changes, will commit some code changes locally to the code base to fulfill a ticket, and then they will deploy those changes to the development environment for you to have an initial look at those changes and make sure that you're happy with them and that they look okay. Then the point of having a UAT environment in addition to the development environment is so that you can configure that UAT environment as closely as is possible to how the production environment is going to run, just to give you that additional step of confidence that once you are running Magento and the server in the same way as it will be functioning on a production site, that code that you've tested on dev, if that's then working on UAT environment, which is running very closely in terms of configuration to production, if it works in both those environments, you can be pretty confident that it's going to work correctly and work as it should in the production environment. Realistically, I've found virtually no cases really where code performs differently in the development environment and the UAT environment in terms of anything affected by these additional steps that need to be performed. So for some store owners, just having the UAT environment is absolutely fine. For others, if you want a quick deploy and a quick test, so you might have, say, if you've got a slightly larger project and you've got a development team, then you might want to use the development environment for other developers and people more directly managing the project to actually test changes that have just been deployed. Once it has been tested by those people, then you can put it up to UAT, which is just user approved testing. So that's an environment for people with who are a bit closer to the client, who might be communicating with the client and having work signed off, and yes, this is ready for the client to test, kind of thing. So once it's tested in development, it should function identically on UAT, but sometimes as much as a tool for managing different environments available to different teams working on a project, it can be useful to have multiple environments, and also for the fact that Magento does run in these different modes, just for peace of mind and confidence that your code's going to run correctly in all environments, including production. It can be nice to have multiple environments in front of production. This is something which you may not necessarily feel is completely necessary as a client. It really depends on how you want to work, but I think it's a useful thing to have in place anyway, and that is for the developer to be using some form of time tracking software. There's loads of options out there, all of them function pretty well as time tracking tools, and it really depends on personal preference for each developer on which one they would prefer to use. There are some which do things like take screenshots and are a bit more evasive really in terms of tracking exactly what the developer is doing. Some developers, I think rightfully so, are less keen to use these kind of solutions that actually take screenshots of what you're doing, not because they're trying to be evasive, just because it's a bit of an invasion of privacy, isn't it, to be having screenshots of everything that the developer's doing. So I think it's less important to put an emphasis on exact sort of minuscule levels of tracking of exactly what the developer's doing, but in terms of splitting time tracking by task and by time spent on each task, that can be a really useful thing for you to have as a client. So you can break down what time has been spent on each task for each billing period. The time tracking software that I prefer is Paymo, and this is a really good tool for managing a project. You can split time tracking by client, and then by project, and then by task, and even subtasks. So it's pretty fully fledged, and it enables you to create quite a detailed report and a detailed breakdown for the client to be able to view exactly what time has been spent on what task and by which developer. So I would say that ask your developer if they use time tracking software. If it's an important point for you, then you could request that they actually do that, because it's quite useful as a client to have a breakdown, a time report with each invoice showing you what's been spent on what, and it just gives you that real insight into what's been happening and how the project's been progressing. And that can also tie into time tracking on your ticketing system. So some ticketing systems will allow you to track time on there as well, and what I actually do is I use a tool to integrate my time tracking software with the ticketing system. So when I put some time onto a ticket through Paymo, then it will actually update that ticket once I stop the tracker, and it will show the time on there. So it's just about visibility in terms of showing you as a client from the developer side what's been worked on and how much time has been spent on what. So it's a little bit about accountability, it's a little bit about information for you to know exactly what's going on and what time has been spent on what. So that's kind of a useful one, but again, that's really kind of up to you if you think that's a priority or not. But for me, it's proved pretty useful to be able to give that information to the client in the past, so that might be something you want to consider. So the last thing I want to talk about is actually a tool that your developer should be using to actually write their code and make code changes to the code base for your store. And this is an IDE. You may or may not have heard of an IDE, but basically it's just a glorified text editor, really, not much more than that. But it does give you a lot of tools and a lot of flexibility with working with different kinds of code and different standards of code and different languages all at the same time. You can very easily navigate the files within the project and locate files which need to be changed, and very easily sort of track changes that have been made and look at historical changes to files. And there's many tools that an IDE will offer in order to allow the developer to much more effectively manage their code and their changes that they're writing. And one really key tool is actually a PHP plugin. It's called Xdebug. It doesn't really matter what this does exactly in any detail, but it basically allows you to as a developer step through lines of code one line at a time and see exactly what actions are being performed by each line of PHP which is being executed. The significance of this is because it's an essential tool really for debugging and fixing issues. So you may, for instance, come across a bug in the store and you might create a ticket for that. When the developer picks that up, the first thing that they will want to try and do is to attempt to reproduce that in their local development environment. And the reason they want to do that is purely because then they can use this Xdebug tool to identify where the code is going wrong and step through the changes. And once they've identified the source of the issue, then they can then work out what needs to change in order to fix that. So yeah, an IDE is an essential tool for any developer to help them to manage the code and manage code changes much more effectively than you ever could with something like just a a text editor like Notepad, or even a more fully fledged one like Sublime Text or something like that. So yeah, that might just be a question that you want to pass on to your developer, possibly just to ask them, hey, what IDE do you use? And depending on the answer you get back, hopefully it's one of those two, NetBeans or PHP Storm. If they're like, what do you mean by an IDE, you might want to think twice about using them, to be honest, because it's a tool that every developer should definitely be using, and it's one of the most useful pieces of software in a developer's toolbox. Thanks for watching the video, and the ideas and the principles and the working methods I've actually talked about today in this video will be things that the developers that you can find on Developer Connection will be very well versed in. So on there we have a open catalogue and a open marketplace where you can go and you can connect with experienced quality Magento developers here in the UK. So go and check us out, and you can expect any developer that you find on there to be very well versed in the things that I've been talking about today, because they will have many years of experience and will have worked on many different stores for many different clients. So go and check us out. It's developerconnection.co.uk, and I hope that you will manage to find a developer on there who really fits the bill for your budget and for what you've got in mind for your project.